Right, it's 9 o'clock on Friday morning in South Africa. Welcome to our podcast this morning. Um, we have guests from all over the planet. Apologies for our US friends who are in the middle of the night. And welcome to everybody from Asia, from New Zealand, and everybody obviously in our time zone in the UK and the Middle East. We're looking forward to a bumper session this morning. I've got two new guests in the studio, and I don't want to call them old project people, but yeah, maybe that's what we get when we do too many projects. And Zep or Jeff, do we get cynical as well, or is that just experience?
Do we get less cynical?
Yeah.
I'd like to think not.
Well done, Zeppo. I appreciate the positivity.
No cynical here.
Right, that's great.
Just cold.
Just cold. Right.
Just cold.
Yes. So the seasons have changed, are busy changing in South Africa. And this morning's podcast is around work breakdown structures. Now, it's a beautiful word in project management, thrown around, misused, and can be the blessing and the curse of your project, all at the same time. And it's kind of one of those topics that will stay with you for the rest of your project management career, and either haunt you or make you successful. So the rules for the podcast this morning, very simple. Please take part, whether virtually or you actually want to participate. Feel free to join us in the discussion. Put your messages in the chat, and we've got people that will pick it up and guide us through the process of engagement. So thanks for that. Also, please join the channel on YouTube. All our podcasts are on YouTube, and we're on number 7 at the moment. So it's really building up to be a library of knowledge, and obviously with the KEY360 angle, the ability to run projects in a whole different way is the bucket list of projects. So running projects in KEY360 is an adventure, and provides a beautiful backdrop for successful project management. Just a couple of introductions. My name is Steve Golding. I'm the CEO and founder of KEY360 and the SSG Group, and we execute projects globally. We provide training. We provide project management support, project control support, forensic support across the globe. And I'm a mechanical engineer by trade, and running technical projects, capital projects throughout the globe over the past 25 odd years. Our moderator this morning is Gerard Ulofse. Gerard comes from the Air Force, actually, and is heading up our training environment. And then we've got two special guests this morning, Zeppo Malunga, who is a specialist project manager with us, and also a systems analyst, as well as a systems implementer. So in the nuts and bolts of running projects. And then we've got Jeff Golding joining us this morning. Specialist planner, has been in planning for many years. That's where the bald spots come from. Right, so without much further ado, let's jump into this morning's session. So the bucket list of projects is always where we start, and feel free, again, as I said, to answer the questions. We're going to dive into some deep topics. The time seems to fly past very quickly when we do these podcasts, so we'll try and get through everything. Question: is the work breakdown structure a blessing or a curse on your project? And I want to put it straight to the audience. We're gonna get into the heart of this. So yeah, Jeff.
WBS is an interesting animal. If you get it right, project somehow falls into a structure that allows a GPS coordination of data. If you get it wrong, it is very painful.
Right. So we're talking about structure, right? So we'll dive into the real heart of what we're actually talking about. So let's start at the top for those who really don't understand. What does work breakdown structure stand for? What are we actually talking about here?
Well, work breakdown structure effectively forms the backbone of your data. It's made up of a methodology doing the entire project and being able to trace data from different phases and disciplines and being able to attach them together.
Right. Zeppo, your view on that?
Yeah, it is obviously a breakdown, as it says, it's a breakdown of work simplistically into smaller chunks so that you can be able to do it. So simply breaking down the work in a way that you'll be able to identify each component, at least to the source as well. So
right.
Imagine a family tree. I think I would say simplistically, imagine a family tree.
Okay, so I mean, it's we rely on ChatGPT to assist us with a lot of what we do. So I just jumped into ChatGPT to look at what he or she says about it. So work breakdown structure is a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by a project team. Now this is important because it as Jeff indicated, it defines how, right? It defines how we break up this large animal that we call a project, and how we break it up into small pieces of work. Okay, so work breakdown structure is a term that's used sort of widely in project management, but actually is composed of all sorts of elements. So Zeppo, what are the elements of work breakdown structure? I mean, it's not just work, right? It's other elements as well.
Yeah, so you can obviously, by breaking down the work, you can identify the quantities, and it is easier, obviously, to expand that into the timings thereof. So Jeff was very right in saying that it's a backbone of everything where the project starts. So I think it develops into other things. As I mentioned, you can now sort of quantify the work, the timings thereof, but obviously still leading back to what the work was that has to be delivered.
Yeah. So it effectively starts giving us smaller pieces of data for us to work into the project. And I think this is, I'm laboring this a little bit because it's really important to understand the methodology of building a project. So we don't build a project in one shot. We need to be able to break it down into smaller pieces, and those smaller pieces can have all sorts of different aspects, right? So if we just look at sort of the basics, we need to be able to break projects down into phases, right? For timing perceptions, we need to be able to break a project down into different disciplines. We need to be able to break a project down into different geographical areas. and equipment. And then how we procure. So when we start venturing into work breakdown structure, the permutations of what we actually apply become practically endless. And obviously, this all needs to refer to time and cost and all sorts of other elements of the project that we need to look at. So understanding work breakdown structure is really one of the first building blocks that you should learn about methodology in project execution. So it's not something to be taken lightly. And why this with the specific podcast is called Blessing or Curse is because as your project size increases, the way that you execute and your work breakdown structure actually impacts on the outcome of the job. Okay. And we're going to look at that today and how we're going to structure that so that we can answer these questions. Now, we probably won't get through much in this podcast other than to say it is so important to get this right that you should stop here and make it a primary element of the setup of the project. Now, when we dive into KEY360 in a minute, we'll see what that actually means and how important that is to get that set up right, because it permeates through the entire cross section of the project. Now, in capital projects, we're generally producing a physical asset, right? So we can all see on the screen we've got an offshore platform, and in a really fundamental perspective, an offshore platform is a capital project and eventually needs to be designed and built. But it's a huge undertaking, and we need to look at that undertaking and say, well, how do we actually approach this, and how does the work breakdown structure allow us to venture around the structure of this this model? So, Jeff, when we look at packaging of this, how many levels does a work breakdown structure actually have, and how does this impact on the data set that we're working with? Because every time we add a new level of breakdown structure, we obviously add a complexity to the project.
I think it depends on the perception of the person looking at the data set. So to put it in perspective, if you're the client, you tend to view the data set at a much higher level than you would if you were the contractor doing the steel work.
Right.
I find that, from my experience, most projects find that Zoom capability difficult to manage. So we find clients that have schedules that are far too big, and we find contractors that have schedules that are far too small. And that's because, from my experience, the lack of understanding of what level of WBS you should be working at. The other thing that I find affects WBS management is this ability to zoom in and zoom out. Imagine you're looking at Google Earth. If you've zoomed in too far, you can't find Asia. And if you've zoomed out too far, you probably won't find Babsfontein. So it's about understanding the depth of detail that you need to perceive to then manage the data set applicable to you the best.
Correct. Now Zeppo made a comment earlier. The work breakdown structure is very similar to Zeppo. I think you called it a family tree, right?
I did indeed.
You did indeed. So taking an asset and breaking it down into different levels adds complexity, but also adds control to the ability to manage the project, right? So as we venture down the family tree, so to speak, and we add elements of WBS into the project, the data set becomes larger and more complex to manage, right? So we need to be able to have that type of control. And as Jeff indicated, the level of control is extremely important. And how's that determined, Zeppel? What are the metrics around determining how low we go into the WBS? Because I mean, we could literally control at any level of that WBS, all the way down to a level which makes it unpractical to manage. So how do we determine what level is relevant?
Yeah, so I think most importantly, I mean, usually organizations determine that structure. So the part of the governance to say in a certain typical project, obviously for an organization that does project, you will have typically what levels one has to go to, because really what Jeff was saying, it can get to a level of detail that it becomes impractical to manage. But obviously depending on who is looking at the WBS, if you are if you're a steel fabricator, you will be looking at the level of detail that is pertaining to yourself. But the project manager is going to be looking at the overall picture. So depending on where you are in the structure, obviously depends what you see. But most importantly, you have to always be able to trace it back to the one piece, the one component, the one asset. But I think it has to be part of the governance, but then at the same time saying part of the governance, it shouldn't be so rigid that you can't change if the project demands so. So I think the governance is important, but at the same time taking into account that projects are unique, and so you have to be flexible as you need to.
But how do we manage that flexibility? So I mean, who determines work breakdown structure?
I would say the project manager together with the team. It shouldn't be, I wouldn't say it should be a one-person job. It should be the project manager and the team that supports him. Planning, estimating, those kind of things. So I mean, people that would understand how the work is going to be done, engineering, that kind of thing, depending what kind of project it is. So it shouldn't be a one-man job, I would think.
Right. So I mean, it's an interesting question, because when you ask the engineers who determines the WBS, the engineers would say, no, we are the custodians of the WBS. And when you ask the procurement guys, then they have a view of the WBS. When we ask the cost managers and the cost engineers, they would say, but they actually control the WBS, or let's put it, the cost breakdown structure portion of the WBS. So there are various aspects that all play together in terms of how a WBS is structured, and I think that's the message this morning, is that you need to get this right. And Zeppo, you referred to timing of the breakdown structure. When the breakdown structure is developed is also important. So if we jump down again into our gate model, which is our sort of guiding light in terms of how projects are executed, the work breakdown structure and all the elements of the work breakdown structure, which we'll go into in a second, because it's not just work breakdown structure. They're all developed as we go through the different phases of the project. And as we go through these phases of the project, we can develop more and more detail into that structure. Now, what's really important is that structure also allows us to work and compare information through different areas and phases of the project. So if we look at something like an engineering discipline, we need to be able to use the same engineering discipline for various areas in the project, because doing that allows us to actually compare data sets with each other. Right? So if we're using a similar work breakdown structure across the project, that allows us to view information, whether it's cost information or risk information or documents or schedule items, against the same backbone. Jeff, that word that you used earlier, that backbone structure of packages, of cost breakdown structure, of work breakdown structure, must be permeated through the whole project. Now, I just want to open up two little aspects that we sort of touched on but didn't go into. So the first element is change management, right? So the work breakdown structure is such a fundamental part of how we build projects. It must be under change management, Zep, or is that right?
Pardon, Stephen, I couldn't hear that.
So what the question was, it's such a fundamental part of how we execute projects. The project breakdown structure. So if we move away from work breakdown structure, we look at project breakdown structure, because we're actually looking at the package breakdown structure. We're looking at the system breakdown structure from an engineering perspective. We're looking at costing and code of accounts as a form of work breakdown structure. These elements influence the data set of the project so significantly. This must be under change control. So it's part of the configuration, right?
It is, because obviously upfront there has to be that mapping. I believe that when the project is undertaken, you have got a roadmap of what has to fit where. And I think if it's left to the project team or the procurement team, or the project team as a whole, I think you're inviting a disaster. So I think I like to. Many people that talk to me quite a bit will know that I'm very embedded in governance, because I think if the mapping is done up front on what the direction that the projects have to follow, then people are not running around without trying to figure out what has to be done, because it's already predetermined. So I'm
Correct.
a big believer in governance.
And the impact of changing a work breakdown structure is significant, because it actually impacts on the way documents have been packaged. It influences the way schedules have been built. It influences the way costs are aligned. And as the project goes down the life cycle, the impact of WBS also increases, because it becomes more detailed and more advanced. So obviously, that also has a massive impact on the job. I want to leave this slide for a second and jump into KEY360, because I think it's really important to understand how WBS is actually designed into a project and where it starts. Because if you have the right platform technology, you're able to actually do that up front, and more importantly, do it in an integrated fashion. So KEY360 is a capital project management platform. We're also moving into all sorts of other areas because of our workflow capability and because of the data analytics that you can do. So it's moving dramatically. But in capital projects, one of the setup functions fundamentally in KEY360 is the ability to build a project breakdown structure, which is our first element here. Now, it influences the rest of the setup of the project. So it influences estimate development. It influences how we structure deliverables lists for documents and engineering. It influences the cost base and how that works. It influences obviously the timing and the Gantt, and then drilling down into all the different phases and structural elements of the project. So when we develop the project work breakdown structure in a KEY360 environment, it is a centralized function. Now, what's important about that is that whether we're looking at a cost report, you'll see here we're looking at a cost report, and these colored items on the right-hand side, you'll recognize these colors after this podcast as a theme that runs through the entire project, right? So we've taken the liberty of a couple of elements here. Now in KEY360, when we set up work breakdown structure, we're actually talking about work breakdown structure. Let me just bump this up to a better resolution here so that we can see it. So we're looking at work breakdown structure. We're looking at cost breakdown structure. We're looking at procurement breakdown structure, as well as any other metadata that we want to add to these items. And you'll see that this structure is separated from the physical elements. So we've got a cost report here. Let's open up a Gantt here. You'll see the same colors. You'll see the same wording. You'll see the same codes, and you'll see the same naming conventions. Now, this is important because to be able to use what we call a centralized work breakdown structure, both units, so different elements of your project controls environment, must refer to the same breakdown structure. So if we venture into this grid, we'll see here that we've got these work breakdown structures configured. And if we go into discipline as an example, KEY360 allows the color coding of those disciplines. So this list, which is typical engineering disciplines, and these can be configured endlessly. There's no limit to the codes. There's no limit to the naming convention. And what this allows projects to do is use this information as the work breakdown structure, as the metadata structure behind all the elements of the project. So whether we're looking at a Gantt structure or a cost structure or a document management structure or a tracking structure, we will see these common themes, these golden threads running through the project inside KEY360 because they've been designed and set up in a centralized function. And obviously, all relating back to our physical asset. Okay, so as we saw in the presentation, we need to be able to work between our physical asset and the design elements and the project controls elements which guide that process. So this link between what we're actually building and how we're building it is absolutely fundamental. And this impacts on all sorts of areas. So when we report out of project controls, when we report out of systems, we must have the ability to report against this directly from the management platforms that we're using. And KEY360 is exceptional in creating that view of the information that allows us to report and dashboard from this information from a centralized fashion, because each element of the project, from purchasing through costing, man-hour management, developing S curves and the breakdown of those S curves, budgeting and estimating, they're all referring to a centralized work breakdown structure or project metadata structure. Okay, so let's talk about estimate development, right? So, Zeppo, when does the first estimate get built on a project?
That's maybe as early as when you have an idea, obviously. So if you stick to your gated model there, idea, you can have an estimate over there. Obviously, the estimate will look different down the line. If you go into execution, it will look different. But depending on, I think what drives the estimate is obviously the scope definition. So
Right.
that early on, the estimate can be developed.
So again, in the earliest stages of the project, right from idea development, we know what the asset is that we're developing. We know how it's going to be structured, and we start building those elements of the work breakdown structure at those early stages. So it's very important to understand that work breakdown structure needs to be developed from the earliest stages of the project. We had a session with an oil and gas client in Canada this week, a workshop, and the question was around how do we actually design work breakdown structure early in the project to facilitate the handover to the client in terms of all the elements. So when we hand over to the client, how do we do that, Jeff? So how do we bridge this gap from here to there? Because and the point that we need to realize is that this handover is also determined way back early in the process. So if we look at breakdown structure in terms of commissioning and handover, what do we need to keep in mind?
If you know where you're going and you understand the final deliverable to the client, it becomes very simple to then backstep to where you're currently standing, regardless of the current phase that your project is in, the life cycle that your project is in.
So I'm going to jump into a commissioning view here, because, and let me just bump this resolution up here. All right, so this discussion this week was critical for this client, because what they were saying is that they need KEY360 to facilitate the asset handover, transfer, and documentation to the client. And with the right work breakdown structure, we're able to transition the view of the information. So taking a schedule view and actually transition that view from an area view, which allows us to facilitate progress at high rates during the middle phase of the project, but at about 60 or 70%, we need to be able to pivot that view into a systems view, because projects are generally handed over and commissioned in terms of a systems view, right? So that systems view needs to be contemplated, as you said, Jeff, way early in the game, so that we can actually pivot the same data set, be it bills of quantities, be it progress data in terms of fabrication tracking and construction tracking of these of specific items on the project, and pivot that view into a commissioning a systems view. So and then use that same pivot and that same data to hand over the right document to the client. So a lack of that information and that type of structure doesn't allow you to actually pivot the data set and carry on with progress tracking as you're going. Yes, Jeff?
You used a very special word there. Pivot.
Yeah.
80% of WBSs that we run into are pure hierarchical structures. If your WBS cannot pivot, data management becomes almost impossible, especially when the data set starts to grow. Pivot is the number one word in WBS.
Okay, wait, we need to unpack this a little bit. So what you're saying is that when we look at a data set, now we're looking at a cost report here and the different elements. To view that data set, what we're actually seeing is that in the first step, we needed codified, right? Sorry, guys, let me jump out of there. So the first step in the process is we needed coded according to the work breakdown structure. What we need this metadata added to the data set, okay? And I've used conditional formatting to highlight the areas of this data set which have not been coded. Okay, and what that does is that it creates data which is uncategorized. Okay, so we can't find them, we can't pivot them, we can't use that information. Right? So that's the first step in the process. But what you're saying, Jeff, is that to use the metadata effectively in data analysis and reporting, we need to be able to, one, codify the information, right? Not in a tree structure, not in a hierarchical structure, but in a metadata structure, so that, and I'm just jumping into KEY360 here, we can drag and drop those pivots inside the platform to a point where now we've got unpivoted data, unstructured data. So this is a typical cost report, but very easily, if we have this data set up correctly, we can drag a pivot or a grouping into the grid, which allows us to structure this cost report by phase. Okay, so where we have unstructured data here, right, a list of items in a typical cost report, or in a schedule, or in a doc list, if we have this metadata structure, one, set up correctly, and two, all filled in, we can then structure this data according to that metadata that we've actually that we've applied. And typically we have different audiences on the same set of data. So we may have an engineering manager who wants to see the cost report by engineering discipline. That's how they structure the information. We have a client who might say, no, I want to see this data structured by cost element, by cost bucket, because I want to be able to see how this information is structured. And then we have a project manager who says, no, I need to be able to see this information pivoted by the project phase, fabrication, construction, engineering, etc. So yes, Jeff, I agree with you 100%. You need the metadata applied to the data set to be able to pivot the data effectively. Okay, and that influences so many man hours down the road in terms of project execution, as well as the clarity of managing cost, managing schedule, managing risk, managing progress. It impacts on every single aspect of the project. And where we have unstructured data, we have items which are outside of our control, right? So now suddenly we've got elements that are outside of our control. And in KEY360, obviously we can conditional format these to be able to produce a visual tracker. So it's a human nature thing to ensure that people are actually filling in these fields correctly, and on a consistent basis, that metadata is completed and actioned. Now, sometimes that metadata structure, that work breakdown structure, actually doesn't apply to a specific grid, right? So sometimes work breakdown structure applies, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the package list applies, and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so in a KEY360 environment, we have the ability to select which of these metadata items, either from an internal project or an external project, actually apply to this data set. Okay, so we may not apply the cost breakdown structure to a document list. So in a document list, obviously something like engineering discipline would be extremely valuable to be able to codify documents against that item. Now, doc type is another one. So all of these elements of the breakdown structure of the project are actually the fundamental building blocks of what we do. All right, let's move on to how the work breakdown structure impacts on other areas of the project. So, Zeppo, where else does the work breakdown structure apply to facilitate effective project management?
I think you already touched on most of it. Obviously, we talked about engineering, we talked about procurement. It is still tracking the same thing. It's just that different parties are interested in different things, but we're still talking about if you're going to be in procurement, procuring civils, as an example, you're still going to be procuring against a certain WBS. So you already talked about costing and accounting as an example. It was very interesting, obviously, when we were pivoting the information according to probably the interest group. And that is obviously very interesting of what KEY360 can do to meet all those deliverables for each, those views that each party might be interested in. But the interesting part is that you're still talking about the same thing pretty much. So, and if you stick to what the WBS it has to be, this is where we said that can be a blessing downstream, because then it means that everybody can have a different view, but of the same thing, because literally you're tracking the same thing, all of you.
I think that's so important. So when we look at the KEY360 systems list, of which this is a sort of a summary, what we're seeing is that all the way through from integration, through human resources, through communication management, which is something as simple as document management and minutes of meeting and normal action lists, all of those should be codified by a centralized work breakdown structure, right? So all of these elements require the same backbone of information, and we're going to get to the curse in a second, because we're sort of talking about the good stuff, okay? But lend your minds to the to what happens when the work breakdown structure is not structured, and when it's not done properly, and when it's not one of the most important elements of your project setup. So as we look through this list, we're looking at scope development. Okay, so scoping, estimating, building those building blocks of your project, all categorized according to a single work breakdown structure. Obviously, time and cost are major elements. We're gonna get back to that in a second. So, quality management. Again, we talked about the ability to pivot information through the phases, and then pivot that information to a client. So handing over information to a client in the right structure with the right disciplines is obviously one of the blessings of applying a good project breakdown structure to a data set. Risk management extensively allows us to apply risk management to the right areas. And under risk management, we also facilitate lessons learned, right? So applying lessons learned and lessons listed and evaluating those against the risk matrix allow us to use the work breakdown structure effectively. And we can say the same for health and safety and all the phases of the project. I want to stop at time and cost, okay, for a second, because the curse of work breakdown structure really hits home when we can't manage time and cost, right? When our structures get out of sync, when our packaging is not working right, when our invoicing does not look at our estimate, and we start losing control of the project. So that's when the work breakdown structure can actually become a curse. So, Zeppo, let's talk a little bit about earned value, one of your, well, actually both of yours, pet subject, right? So how does work breakdown structure impact on earned value calculation? And this is not an earned value podcast. We're going to do one of those. We're going to dive in there. We're going to get really dirty and talk about that. But the WBS discussion lends itself to how to work earned value. And what is the critical element here?
I was hoping this was not going to come up.
you knew I was going to go there, Zeppo.
Because I think I always say that sometimes, you know, it's the curse of maybe backtracking a bit to the curse of when the WBS is not done properly, and obviously the obvious schedule and cost are not aligned. You know, then along the way somebody says, "Can somebody give me earned value?" And it's like, why? How? So anyway, so the importance obviously is that right early on, we already talked about this, that schedule and cost, and obviously all the other things in between have to be aligned, have to be, I mean, obviously we already know that the schedule can go to lower levels as practical as possible, but however, we still have to track it to we have to still find the commonality in all that. So at least maybe the first 3-4 levels have to still be very identifiable. So I think the if you don't do that from the onset, forget about earned value. You should leave it at PMI books and just go on with your life.
Yeah, and sadly, Zeppo, I think that's where most projects end up, right? And it's actually so easy to solve. It's not a difficult thing to solve. And what surprises me is that project after project, we see the same symptoms of projects that know that they should do this correctly. They know that they should structure this correctly, and still they do not. Even though it's in the lessons learned, it's in the risk, it's required by the reporting, it's mentioned everywhere. It's part of the methodology that that earned value should be done, but we still see that there's no centralized work breakdown structure, so that we can actually compare the time aspects of the project with the cost aspects of the project. And it's actually very easy to achieve, right?
Maybe let me say something at the
Or is it?
The main problem, at least in my experience that I've observed, is that organizations don't allow enough time for projects to be planned properly. When I say planning, I don't mean the scheduling and that timing. I mean planning projects properly, because that takes care of a lot of things. So whatever you're going to do downstream, you should have planned for it. Only along the way people start want to track things and report, but they forget that they didn't allow time to do the things that they know they're supposed to do. So now we are here. And reporting is required, tracking is required, but it's too late.
Yeah, from my experience, I see that, and I take my kids, for example. When they jump on a bicycle, what's the first thing they put on? The safety gear. A decent WBS is the first line of safety to a project success. If the WBS is built early enough and is driven through the entire project structure, including BOQs, mechanical lists, that data can then explode to any size, but can always be rolled back up. And if that is meticulously attached to cost, effectively earned value is a product without any effort. But if you forget that at any point, suddenly you're left with this mist, and the planner asks a cost department, can you please insert costs into a schedule, or vice versa, time into costs? Then all the wheels fall off because the child hasn't put the helmet on.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Jeff. Zeppo, would you allow me to disagree with you? And why I'm saying that is I don't think it's a time issue, because even projects that run through an idea stage and feasibility, pre-feasibility stage for years, still don't apply the right work breakdown structure and project breakdown structure. So I'd like to query that in terms of, does it take that long? to do it correctly? Is it not a pure understanding issue in terms of the impact of this, and a capability issue? So everybody knows that this should be done, right? You wouldn't find anybody disagreeing that this should be done. And still we see projects going into execution without these building blocks. Jeff, in your analogy with the safety gear being in place, it's not done. And these projects still execute, and they waste millions of dollars of man hours and potential time impact and cost impact because these structures are not in place. And then the handover is a mess, and the execution is a mess. So what is the fundamental issue here? It seems to be more that there's one, an understanding problem, and two, an actual detailed execution problem, and potentially a silo effect that happens. We're doing our stuff, so my schedule's fine, I don't care about the cost, or my engineering is fine, I don't care about the schedule. This type of mentality that sort of creeps into mega projects where these things simply aren't aligned, and the project managers are not strong enough to stop and actually get this right.
Under the impacts are late. The impacts are late. When I am going to go anywhere in the modern world, what's the first thing I switch on? A GPS.
Right.
Housing projects are given the drive to prepare that GPS prior to leaving on the trip. You sort of get halfway down the trip and go, hold on, we forgot to check the traffic, we forgot to check the toll roads, we forgot to check so we're actually running in blindly but bravely to simply stub our toes later. And if we knew what was coming, we could start that pathfinding, that building a generic set of what have we hit, lessons learned, and how do we avoid them, and how do we build a structure that clearly defines the end early so that we know what to prepare for. Make sure that GPS is set up correctly before the trip starts.
So Zeppo, you saw a mining client this week, right? Platinum. And we've got the same problem. You've got an earned value requirement, and you hoped I wouldn't go there. I know. You got an earned value requirement. You have a schedule which doesn't even look at the cost elements directly. The work breakdown structure is obviously not there. We have a client team that is trying to achieve this, and an EPCM team who doesn't apply this effectively, or doesn't understand, or is not allowed to. What are the fundamentals here?
Yeah, I think maybe let me defend my position of
Yeah.
The planning not enough time. I think I like what Jeff just said, that when things are rushed, because usually the projects would be rushed and because there is a business need that has to be fulfilled. So everything else is so you just skim through things. And I like the analogy that obviously there are certain things that you have to take into consideration. So you build a WBS, but at the same time, there's a lot of other things that you need to take into consideration in executing the project, which obviously if you have allowed yourself enough time to think about those things. I mean, they always say, this is the known saying that if you don't plan projects, you plan to fail. So I think that timing, it maybe just aligning to what Jeff was saying, to come into the client, and I think that client is not unique. It's exactly what we've been saying, that everybody along the way would want earned value at some point, because it's something that everybody just seems to think to solve their problems. But
it provides massive insight into the progress cost conundrum, right?
Correct. And obviously with this particular client, we had to make a lot of assumptions to sort of even produce some level of reporting, and pleased to obviously report that the client was very happy with what we produced, and we knew that obviously we could do better than that, but if we're just working with what we have. But obviously, like I said, it's not a unique position for most clients. I mean, we had to leave the schedule practically at the project level because there was no way that schedule was talking to the cost. And I think also you will find out that the costing most of the time is the one that is a little bit more developed, and most of the people, the accounting will be calling the shots in most instances. So we find that there is a lot more emphasis there, forgetting about the schedule, which is crazy to me that you're tracking the same thing and everybody's worried about the bottom line. And so, yeah, so I guess,
it makes no sense.
Yeah.
No, and you're right, the language is the problem. If I'm going on a trip, one of the things I will check on my GPS is everybody talking the same language.
Right.
Getting instructions in Spanish is really entertaining, but it doesn't get you anywhere if you can't speak the language.
Yeah.
And maybe, so Stephen, something to throw in there quickly is that the discipline as well in organizations for people to, so even if you plan what you mentioned, that you plan the project properly and you've got your structures in place, but the discipline to
of course
that is not being emphasized enough, that
of course
can deviate and consequences when people deviate. So I think that's also a very strong element that is coming from experience, that there's no discipline and there are no consequences when people do what they want to do and not plan.
And they don't realize the impact of what they're doing, right? So if we just do a quick a review of what we've looked at, so the WBS comes from the physical asset. It is informed and impacts the execution methodology dramatically. So all of those areas need to be looked at. Obviously, it influences every single part of the project directly, okay, and influences the effect of execution. So having a centralized, well-structured work breakdown structure with the right change mechanisms in place, so that we don't have engineering venturing in a direction and scheduling doing their own thing and document control doing their own thing, etc. So that's important. The strategy of the project, which is determined upfront and actually modified down the line as you get into execution, the ability to estimate effectively, the ability to package the project effectively, then defining the physical asset, and then the time cost element of that, and the impact on the project is really in terms of data structures, analytics, handover, the efficiency of how the project actually runs and how it's structured. The whole engineering effort is based on the work breakdown structure. The packaging and the ensuing fabrication and construction is based on the work breakdown structure. So you've got a key strategic element which is missing when you start executing the project. And this is the curse of the WBS, is that it doesn't help us. And then, as Jeff mentioned, the data pivots are so fundamental in the whole environment. And then we eventually get to the curse of earned value. And in our opinion, from a KEY360 perspective, if you have a centralized work breakdown structure, which permeates through the whole project and which is actually separated from the silos of execution, you have a 100% chance of achieving success, because all the different departments, all the different disciplines, all the different elements of the project are pointing towards a centralized work breakdown structure and procurement breakdown structure and a cost breakdown structure. Right. And this permeates all the way down into things like the mobile app, which is codified at the same level, the web structures. And then we move into dashboarding. And again, we see these elements come out in dashboarding because the structure of the work breakdown structure, the structure of the cost breakdown structure, the earned value calculations, which we see hidden around the back here, all come as a direct result of running the project effectively. We've unpacked a lot of items this morning. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the experts who are who've been advising us this morning. I think if we've achieved anything, we want to make sure that you understand the importance of building this all the way up front in the project strategy, in the phase model, and then selecting a platform. Obviously, KEY360 does this as a matter of fact, and saves millions of man hours in the process. But select a system which allows you to coordinate and integrate all the different elements of the project into a centralized and structured work breakdown structure, so that eventually you have the ability to build information at every single level of the project into the boardroom, and then eventually into fully integrated operation centers. Okay, just a final comment by the panel. Any questions from your side? Any questions from anybody online?
I think from my end is that plan and stick to the plan, and considering all elements that are affected. Don't just concentrate on the one that tickles your fancy. Schedule on its own is not a project. Cost on its own is not project. So we need to consider all elements of the project and how they affect the overall and how they affect each other.
And we love earned value, right, Zeppo?
I would say earned value is an organic product of doing projects properly.
That's a great comment. I agree.
There shouldn't be another doing. It's organic.
It should be just a matter of fact, right?
Correct.
Jeff, comments from your end?
Experience tells me that clean data in puts great reports out.
And the curse on the other side of the coin is, yeah.
That's what they call me.
Rubbish in, rubbish out. All right. Fortunately, if clients did it properly, we wouldn't have a job in consulting. So yeah. But we do love working with clients that really prioritize the setup function and building the structure of the project to a robust state, so that the rest of the job runs like a well-oiled machine. Are there any questions online from anybody? Gerard, the panel? Right, then we...
Nothing on this side, thank you.
All right, so we're done for the morning. We hope you all enjoyed the discussion, and it prompted a couple of questions and hopefully some excitement in your mind about doing this correctly. We look forward to next week, and please follow our YouTube channel, like the video, share the video. We'll see you all next week, and yeah, have a great week.
Stephen,
Sorry, we have
Yes.
a question, Steve?
we have a question in the chat.
Yes.
It's asking, the attendee is asking, as you mentioned, the WBS breaks into phases, discipline, areas, equipment. Is the magnitude of these areas, let me just go in there, sorry. Is the magnitude of these areas considered for the WBS to be applicable?
Well, that WBS is determined by the physical asset, right? And there are a multitude of layers that you can add into that WBS. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's a function of engineering as well as the different elements of the project to determine what that breakdown looks like, and how that is actually structured into the data set so that we can execute the project effectively. Right. Any other feedback, and maybe just a comment from that specific person, if that answered the question?
It appears so. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, that's the end of the show this morning. Thank you all for attending. We will see you next week.